Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackson Moore-Otto, CAS Economics, and my wonderful advisor is Professor Schilde, who's here. I don't know if you want to wave. So for my presentation, I'm discussing both how and why to study green industrial policy. And more broadly, as a research project, I'm aiming to understand cross-national variation in how states go about formulating and implementing green industrial policy, and I'm particularly interested in the role that bureaucratic structure and bureaucratic interaction play. And I'm focused on both the why and how. I think whenever you're excerpting from a larger research project to a smaller presentation, there's the challenge of what you take out. So I'm going to discuss really the why mostly, and then get into the how in my own research project and my own thinking later on. So I think it makes sense to start with saying, what is green industrial policy? So there's a great block quote up here that I think captures it pretty well. But what the really important takeaway is it's a state intervention in the economy to shift resources from one sector to the other to affect relative prices. And when we say green, we mean this is being done in the service of decarbonization, however the specific policy implement is working. And I think it's really useful to juxtapose this against two what I think of as fairly common mental models of climate action. The first is that it all boils down to individual choices. And I think most of us, maybe all of us here, understand what's wrong with this. Things like not idling, turning off the lights. We understand that these ultimately don't aggregate up to much. But the other mental model that I think is equally as pernicious, maybe more so, is this belief that it all boils down to a few bad actors. There's a now maybe a bit infamous 2018 Guardian article that linked most global emissions to 100 actors. Most of them are oil companies. So this isn't really analytically useful. And I think when we think about decarbonization broadly, it's useful to think of relative prices and technologies. And studying industrial policy forces us to really put these in the foreground of our analysis. And more broadly, it's timely, it's policy relevant, and I would argue it's really inevitable. Climate change is an issue that most governments care about. They are only caring about it more and more as each year goes by. And as we see more broad-based policies like carbon taxation either not have their intended results or meet fierce pushback, as has happened in France, as has happened in the Western US, governments might move toward more sectoral policies that can be done somewhat quietly. This brings us into why I find it, as a scholar, so compelling. It can often be hidden. It's not always explicit. It's not always clear what constitutes green industrial policy or what agency is in charge. And because of this, it's understudied. So I think it's both a pressing policy question and a really interesting intellectual puzzle. And in my own thinking, the US has been a really interesting case study and motivation point. So I think most of us, when we think of the US political economic system, we think it's quite laissez-faire, it's a capitalist system. There isn't a lot of state intervention in the economy. Most of us probably think of that. And there's a lot of truth to that, but it's not quite true. The US does a lot of industrial policy, and perhaps it's most famous in defense. Some of you might know of DARPA, which is tasked with bringing emerging technologies relevant to defense to market. It almost acts like a venture capitalist, takes a very activist role. But also, we see this for climate, not to the same extent, but to some degree. ARPA-E, modeled after DARPA, sits within the Department of Energy and does much the same thing. There's also the DOE's Loan Program Office, which is charged with delivering well below market rate loans, again, shifting relative prices to clean tech companies. So there's an interesting thing here happening in the US that we might not quite recognize at first. And this brings me into the broader scholarly puzzle. There aren't obvious sources of variation. It probably doesn't boil down, at least not exclusively, to political leadership or to economic structure, if we see this in the US. And the current literature doesn't have much to say. It talks about specific green industrial policies and specific bureaucracies, but it doesn't really trace out cross-national variation or give a framework we could use. So, based on my own coursework and my own interests, I decided to look at bureaucratic structure, particularly interactions between different bureaucracies, those tasked with green industrial policy and those not, and more broadly, what these bureaucracies do. And here's a table that sort of outlines in roughly left to right chronological order my thought process. I'm not going to narrate this, don't worry, but it might be helpful to look at. But I think the rightmost cell really sums up where I ended up, which is looking at specific attributes of the bureaucracy and coming out of studies of previous industrial policy, not green industrial policy, but more general economic interventions. There are two relevant metrics, embeddedness and autonomy. And autonomy measures how well a bureaucracy can resist outside pressure, political meddling. It's probably a pretty straightforward metric. Most of you can think of cases of bureaucracies that might be more or less autonomous. But the second metric that is just as important is embeddedness, how connected a bureaucracy is to the private sector, to, say, clean tech firms, to other parts of civil society. And these are the two metrics that I thought were really, really interesting. Now, this leads us into the question of how we measure them. We could do so at the macro level. Maybe generally some governments possess more or less embedded and autonomous bureaucracies. Or we could take a more quantitative tack and go at the micro level and really develop specific quantifiable metrics for what constitutes embeddedness and autonomy and measure those and then measure how those affect important outputs like R&D spending on green technology. Unfortunately, the data sets don't really exist yet. So while I've developed some metrics, we don't quite have the data that I could use to do a traditional quantitative analysis. So this brings us back to the macro level, looking at factors in a state structure that might determine embeddedness and autonomy. Generally, even if we can't put numbers on it, we can make a pretty compelling argument and have some ideas. So to give some ideas, maybe generally states structure the bureaucracies differently. Maybe there are pilot agencies like DARPA and ARPA-E versus agencies that exist more generally within a ministry. Maybe that's a relevant scale of variation. So a lot of my work has been on developing those, and it's been a tremendous pleasure. I am looking forward to more data becoming available. Acknowledgements, this was funded partly with Europe funding, which I think I should note. So that was wonderful, and thank my wonderful mentor, Professor Schilda, and I will very happily take questions now.
So Jackson, I'm going to start off. I was really fascinated by your 5x5 graph of how you narrowed things down.
Yes.
And I was wondering, if you're thinking about assessing embeddedness
Yes.
and the independence.
Yes.
Is it possible, for example, to study like the transportation ministry in a bunch of different countries, trying to think about something more closely connected to this, green parameter than others? Anyway.
Yes, so I think there's a lot to be said for sort of a process tracing case study analysis. That's where I am now. I guess to go back to your very specific example, I would worry about focusing on just one specific ministry or type of agency because there might be important variation in what ministries are tasked with green policy that is also correlated with embeddedness and autonomy. So I think there might be some real limited variable bias there, even in a more qualitative sense, if we were just to focus on one type of agency, which is a challenge that's been in my research, but it's a very good point, and it's something I thought about.
If you had more time and or more resources, including like if more data was available, what would be the next step that you would want to focus on for this project?
That's a great question. So I think if the data sets were available, that would absolutely be what I would be focusing on. I would be going in a more quantitative direction, but this is actually a work in progress. So what I am doing right now is focusing on the more macro side, as I alluded to, and really trying to develop metrics for embeddedness and autonomy that vary across countries, but maybe we can work with without as much data on a bit more of a qualitative level.
Thank you.
Alex.
So even though we don't have, the ideal data set to study this topic yet, I'm wondering, in the U.S. in particular, is there any appreciable role of state-level investments in green policy or industrial policy? All done at the federal level because they have more decision-making power?
That's a great question. Yes, I would say specifically with California, CARB, the California Air Resources Board, is, I would argue, a pretty autonomous bureaucracy. I haven't studied it quite well enough to discuss how embedded it is, but it has a lot of decision-making power that sits apart from the traditional executive or legislative. It's quite autonomous, and that is in charge with developing, for example, the targets for how many EVs should be on the road in California. And yeah.
Just to link in with one of our previous speakers, is it possible, I'm sure this is really challenging, again, from a parameter standpoint, but to think of maybe non-democratic populations, the 60% of the Earth that's in the autocracy zone, and how to parameterize that and think about their policies. I guess they still have ministries and so forth. So.
Yes, I don't know what the other presentation was.
Oh, I'm sorry. So one of your predecessors was talking about how, broadly speaking, there's an evolution on the planet from what the ratio of democracies to autocracies is, and the idea is that the fraction of people living in an autocratic system are growing. Right, and so in terms of setting policy, I guess I think of that perhaps naively as something that comes in a democratic society, and just wondering. So I get this is a really broad question, but you've provoked a lot of thoughts.
No, it's a wonderful question, and I actually think maybe the benefit to focusing on bureaucracy is it's pretty portable between authoritarian and democratic systems. So the embeddedness and autonomy literature comes out of an economic sociologist named Peter Evans, and he was looking at both actually non-democratic and democratic countries as case studies for developing his theory. So he was looking at Japan and Midi, which was in charge of a lot of Japan's industrial policy, and Japan was a democracy at the point. But he's also looking at South Korea when it was under authoritarian rule. So I think bureaucracies can exist in different forms across both autocratic and democratic systems, and it's quite a portable framework.
Any other questions for Jackson? If not, please join me in thanking him again for a great talk.